Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This is Jamal Diwan with Safa Center for Research and Education. And this is the first video in the commentary on Guide of the Believer, Purification and Prayer in Islam. This is a very simple and easy book that was written by a colleague and friend of ours, Imam Mustafa Omar. And he'll talk about why he wrote the book in the introduction, but why I particularly chose this book is because a lot of times when we get into how to purify ourselves, how to pray, there's a lot of superfluous information that gets thrown around. So extra points, things to consider, difference of opinion, all kinds of things that are important, but they're not necessarily the first step. And for many people who are trying to get established in their faith, who are trying to learn how to purify themselves, learn how to pray, these things end up then being extra on top of the basics that they need to figure out. So what this book has done here, what Imam Mustafa has done here is he's stuck to the basics, and he's been very practical, and he'll talk about some of that in the introduction, so I don't want to repeat it. But again, it's called Guide of the Believer, Purification and Prayer in Islam, and it's written by Imam Mustafa Omar. We'll put a link in the section for where you can buy it. It's available on Amazon, but a very, very good book that I recommend to everyone, inshallah. So we'll start with the preface and the introduction. He starts obviously by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending peace upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and mentioning that he wants to focus on the basics as we mentioned before. Then he says that he took a while making this book, that actually it took him about 8 years. He was working on the text, revising, editing, checking different things, talking to people, trying to figure out exactly how to put it together. But in the end he put the text together after about 8 years of research, and he continues to update it and revise it as we speak. Then he moves into the introduction. The first part of the introduction is that part of Islam is that Islam is a complete way of life. So it's not something that really only affects one area at the exclusion of others, but it's something that affects all areas of our lives. And what that means is that Allah has given guidance to the creation through Himself and through the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that guidance then is imperative for us to follow. And sometimes the guidance will come in different forms. It can come in the form of something that's an obligation. It can come in the form of something that's recommended but not required. So it can come at various levels. And those levels then have to also be taken into consideration, which will be talked about in the end of the introduction. But all of it is that all of this things that we do in our lives, especially our acts of worship, are following under the rubric of the divine guidance. And there's major categories of this guidance that exist in Islam. Muslim scholars have put these into different categories. One of them is the major acts of worship, the ibadat. And this includes things related to purification, prayer, fasting, zakat, hajj. They're classified as acts of worship because they're between a person and their Lord rather than between two people themselves. The second major category is al-ahwal al-shakhsiyya, so family matters. And it pertains to everything from marriage to birth to divorce and death, child custody, inheritance. All of these type of things fall under the category of family matters. The third major category is financial transactions or economic transactions, mu'amalat, and it covers everything from the lawful and prohibited in economic contracts and transactions to property ownership, etc. Fourth category is politics and government, ahkam sultaniyya. So basically, how does one on a national level, on an international level, penal code, all of these type of things fall into the area of politics and government. So again is showing that Islam has guidance in all of these places. The fifth is food and clothing. So how does a person dress? What do they eat? What should they not eat? So on. And the sixth is manners and etiquettes. So related to everyday things, visiting the sick, smiling at people, taking care of guests. All of this falls also into the area of tazkiyat and nafs, purification of the soul, also falls here. So you see that there's a broad swipe of the different areas of human existence, and that Islam then has guidance in all of these different areas of human existence. A lot of times this is referred to, the Sharia, this body of guidance is referred to as the Sharia. It's also used, the word fiqh sometimes is also used. I mean, there's some subtleties between usages, what means what. But generally when we talk about the Sharia, we're talking about everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to mankind from guidance. Now, part of that guidance, and this will come up later as well, is that Allah has given that guidance through texts. And so those texts have to have some level of interpretation. So the guidance that Allah Himself has given is the Sharia. But part of that process is that there is this fiqh, there's this area of interpretation that scholars have used, the textual sources that have come from the divine, and they've used those to derive the rulings that we should be living our lives by. So all of those derivations are actually in the body of fiqh, which is to say that since they're derivations, one of them might be right, one of them might be wrong, both of them might be right, but only what is actually correct is the Sharia from Allah, but the fiqh can actually be wider than that. And this is something, again, that is to be studied in more detail in courses like Usul al-Fiqh, the foundations of jurisprudence, or the philosophy of jurisprudence in Islam. There's been many books written on these topics of purification and prayer, so he takes the time in the beginning to explain why he chose it, and also what the methodology that he's going to follow is. And so the point here is that there's 4 ways that learning can occur in this category of rulings. One is to focus on the specific ruling itself, so the ruling on a particular issue. How much of the head needs to be wiped when you pray, how do you make wudu, all of these type of things are specific rulings. The second is the evidence of the ruling itself, from the Quran, from the Hadith, from analogy, consensus, etc. And the third is to focus on the legitimate differences of opinion related to various questions. So you have an issue and you have multiple opinions and you talk about that. And the fourth is to focus on the wisdom behind a particular action. For the everyday Muslim, the most important here are the first and the fourth. Namely, what is the particular ruling on an issue at hand, and what is the wisdom behind that ruling. Why we say this is not because the differences don't matter or because the evidences don't matter. They do. But because that's a secondary level of study. The first level of study is, what is the ruling itself and why do I do it? And so the priority has to be given there. Some people, they want the evidences, they want the Quran and the Sunnah, and of course that's important, partly because it gives you a connection to the text. But in the initial levels, again, the idea is to get an understanding and a conceptualization of what are the different questions that are in front of us, what are the rulings related to them, and then later on in further courses of study, people can go into more detail, inshallah. One of the other things that he focuses on here is practicality, because there's many issues in Islamic law that are somewhat theoretical, especially for us in the modern day. For example, how many camels, or at least for us in the United States, how many camels must you own before you have to pay zakat on them? Or can you drink the water that's left over in a container after a donkey has drank from it? Or if an animal falls into a well, how do you purify that well from the impurities that come as a result? All of these things are interesting questions, and they're important questions, but they're not of the highest level of importance. And so this book doesn't really focus on those. It focuses on things that are more practical. Amongst the things that we'll find in here that you wouldn't find in a traditional book, so to speak, is the question of how to pray on an airplane. So that will come up here as well. And he also tries to balance at some level the legality with the spirituality. So we'll notice that although the book is dealing with rulings, there are points at which he'll kind of slip in some kind of spiritual benefit or concept that needs to be understood. So he also is trying to remind us that comprehensiveness of the law and the teachings of Islam is there, and that we're not kind of irresponsible in our relationship with Allah, in the sense that we are there and we have the responsibility to figure out how it is that we are supposed to worship Him. And so it's important to follow these books and to learn these books, even if sometimes they feel a little bit dry. He then goes into methodologies in Islamic law. So you'll find basically two major approaches when it comes to how to study Islamic law. The first approach that people will talk about is you study a madhab. You follow a particular legal school. And this legal school then is what is to be studied. It's where you find your rulings. It's where you think about all the considerations. Everything is going back to the legal school. One of the drawbacks usually of this method when it's used is that people are extremely strict with not leaving the school. So they say, this is what the school says, you have to follow the school on every single issue. And this is, it's good to follow the school because it provides a level of, consistency in the way that the study occurs and in the way of the person's personal practice. But there is this rigidity point that can come in as well. The second approach is to say we're going to focus on the Quran and the Sunnah. The problem with this is that the Quran and the Sunnah always have to be interpreted. So it's nice in the sense that you have this connection with the Quran and the Sunnah, the textual sources of Islam directly. But who is doing the interpreting? Someone is doing the interpreting. Even with the schools of law, the schools of Islam, of law are about the Quran and the Sunnah, but they're just particular models and methods of interpretation. So these two also have some level of drawback to them or benefit to them, depending on how you look at it. The Muslim in the end is obligated to ask someone that they trust and someone that should and deserves to be asked. On a very practical level, day-to-day level, what do? You ask someone who you trust and deserves to be asked. And that might be someone who has knowledge, but it also should be someone who has a level of piety, that they have shown in their personal lives and interactions that they are concerned about their relationship with Allah, and that means something to them, and then also that they've combined it with a level of study that can be known through degrees, but degrees in and of themselves don't always indicate also the level of a person's study or reliability. The best indicator in this realm is peer recognition. And by peer, we don't mean the masses. I mean peer recognition meaning the body of scholarship. Just like in academia, sociologists, philosophers, historians, all of these people they're published in peer-regulated platforms, and then through that they gain recognition in the field. The optimal method and what he'll follow in this book is to base it on a particular school. So this text is based largely in the Hanafi school, with occasional strayings from the Hanafi school on particular issues if need be, but it's largely based on the Hanafi school, and then it goes outside every now and then. So what this does is that it uses the school as a foundation, while acknowledging that sometimes in our daily lives, and especially in an extremely complicated world, we need to stray from a particular school and go to others which are still within the larger body of Islamic scholarship. So these are very important issues to consider. The last thing is to say that there are categories of Islamic law, there's categories of rulings in Islamic law that we'll talk about in future videos. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.